So I am the Children's Behavioral Health Project Manager at the Massachusetts Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. My day-to-day there is running a statewide coalition called the Children's Mental Health Campaign that launched 11 years ago, focused on reforming the way that we deliver kids' behavioral health care in Massachusetts. We did not start working on substance use prevention until about 3 years ago, the project that I came on board to work on. So the Children's Mental Health Campaign is led by 5 organizations, MSPCC, which is the administrative hub for the campaign where I sit. We're also joined by Boston Children's Hospital, HealthBot Advocates, which is a pro bono law firm that helps folks who are experiencing issues with their health insurance, whether it's getting covered, staying covered, appealing a denial of a claim. They do a lot of the parity work that the campaign does. We also work with Healthcare for All, which does a lot of state-based advocacy around a variety of consumer-led healthcare issues. And then PAL, the Parent Professional Advocacy Groups. These are all parents of children with significant behavioral health needs. So similar to that coalition model, we've launched our Addiction-Free Futures project. So that is what we are calling our Massachusetts counterpart of this 5-state initiative that India mentioned, that is run through Community Catalyst and funded by the Hilton Foundation. So we brought together a lot of different partners. This is not comprehensive. This is to give you an idea of some of the partners we brought to the table to really expand our perspective as the Kids Mental Health Campaign, to make sure that we have adequate representation, first and foremost with youth. We have brought Youth Move Massachusetts and the Hope Coalition on board. Both of those groups do a lot of positive youth development work, youth engagement. We have a youth advisory group that actually informs the work that we're doing around SBIRT, because we want to make sure that we're not advancing something without youth engagement, youth involvement, and really, frankly, their support and buy-in. We're also working a lot with some of the community coalitions around the state. We have the support of the Massachusetts School Nurse Organization, which has been invaluable for us in working on SBIRT in schools in particular. And we also have partnered very closely with Learn to Cope and the Massachusetts Organization for Addiction and Recovery. And it's been, again, invaluable having voices of folks who are in recovery and their families at the table as we start to try to shift the conversation from a focus on treatment and recovery for adults to expanding that to include prevention for youth, as well as early intervention. So, why the Addiction-Free Futures Project? Why do we want to do this work in Massachusetts? When the project launched, Massachusetts was seeing 4 deaths a day as a result of the opioid crisis. And I left this piece in here because I think that we're sort of similarly primed in Massachusetts and in New Jersey to really be taking this conversation deeper to look at prevention, early intervention, and start really shifting the focus to how we're going to support young people and make sure that we're stemming the tide of addiction rather than continuing to sort of fight that downstream battle with treatment and recovery. So this is probably going to be very familiar to all of you, probably seen iterations of this slide before. Teens' brains are still developing. They're more vulnerable to the impacts of alcohol and other drugs. Kids who start drinking alcohol before the age of 15 are 4 times more likely than those who have their first drink after their 21st birthday to develop a substance use disorder. And compared to adults, teens are susceptible to a whole host of other negative consequences. And one of the things that we have tried to stress is that, yes, we're called the Addiction-Free Futures Project. That is a lofty goal. We would love to see at our statewide Recovery Day celebration every year, the age of that crowd skew older and older every year, rather than having more and more young people in the room. That would be incredible. But we also know there are a lot of other social and personal impacts of substance use beyond just substance use disorders. So we'd love to see an impact in all of these areas. So, again, just revisiting alcohol use for teens wires the brain for addiction. Every single year that we can get a kid move further along with healthy brain development without substances involved in impeding that process of healthy brain development, the less likely that young person is to struggle with substance misuse or substance use disorder later in life. So the reason for that is that the brain develops back to front. Is everyone familiar with some version of this slide? That's not quite great. So we won't go into the whole process of myelination and synaptic pruning, but essentially, the reason that teenagers are impulsive and driven to do things that we look at and say, why would you ever do that? Is because they've got the physical coordination. They've got a lot of emotion. They've got the adrenaline pumping. If it sounds like it will feel good right now, it's a great idea. Let's go for it, because the front of their brain has not developed yet. They haven't developed judgment. They don't have the brakes. They are just a very fast car. So the longer we can put off substance use, the better. So our advocacy goals for the Addiction Free Futures Project are to ensure that SBIRT is sustainable. There are a variety of funding streams. We want to increase the number and type of locations where SBIRT is delivered. We want to increase the types of providers that are utilizing SBIRT. And we also want to disseminate lessons that we've learned. So we're checking out that last box today. But before we dive too far into how we're working on those other goals, I want to talk a little bit about what SBIRT is. So just by a show of hands, how many folks are familiar with SBIRT, know what the acronym stands for? All right. And how many folks could name one of the screening tools used for adolescents? All right, we're going to increase that number today. This is great. And it won't be too redundant. For those of you who already know what SBIRT is, bear with me for a couple minutes here. It is not a Sesame Street character. So what is SBIRT? The S is for screening. So we use validated tools when we screen, which means that we're using screening tools that have been well tested, well vetted, demonstrated to get honest answers from, in this case, young people. So SBIRT was developed for use in emergency departments for adults. So the idea is a community health worker, social worker in the emergency department will go talk to somebody who's come in at 11:30 p.m. on a Friday who has sprained their ankle, right? And at that point, it's more of an assessment than a screening, and they're asking questions because they think that substance use might be involved. SBIRT has evolved to be used in a variety of settings, and one of the great applications is the development of tools for use with adolescents to identify use in a way that's not judgmental, not confrontational, things that teenagers don't respond well to. And it allows us to assess whether or not risky substance use may be occurring. Not just that, but what kind of behaviors might surround that substance use that might make it even more risky for an adolescent or an adult. And studies have shown that simply asking young people about drugs and alcohol can lead to positive behavior changes. So one of the coolest things about doing SBIRT with adolescents is that it has been shown in clinical settings to put off first use by up to another year, right? That's huge. I want to make sure that we all absorb that one. Just asking young people about their substance use and learning that they haven't started experimenting yet, haven't tried drugs, alcohol, and giving them positive reinforcement can help put off first use by up to another year. So that's another year of healthy brain development. So if you think back to the chart before, showing how with every year that goes on past 15, the less likely that young person is to develop a substance use disorder once they start using, that's huge. So we want to doing that. Too far. The BI is for brief intervention. So a brief intervention for adolescents relies on motivational interviewing with clinicians in the room, folks familiar with MI. So motivational interviewing is essentially a way of engaging with somebody clinically to have a conversation about behavior that encourages positive behavior change without it being a wrestle, right? So again, when we think about motivators for a young person, we're not going to sit there and say, okay, you're telling me that you have experimented a little bit with marijuana. Don't do that, it's bad. Right? That message is probably not going to resonate with 99.9% of the 16-year-olds you have that conversation with. But there are ways that you can talk to them that are more helpful in encouraging positive behavior change. And a lot of that is about identifying their motivators, identifying how ready they are to make a behavior change, and offering them the support to make that choice for themselves and to give them whatever resources and supports they feel that they need from you to be successful in that behavior change. So instead of saying something like, you know, if your coach catches you, you're going to get kicked off the team, you can say, you know, I hear that you have been experimenting with marijuana. What do you like about it? Which, right, that just, if you're 16 years old and an adult asks you that, sort of just takes the walls right down, because you don't expect that question. You don't expect somebody to care what you like about it. And that helps to open up the next part of the conversation is, well, what do you like less about it? And then that's where you find the motivating factors, right? I'm worried about getting kicked off of the hockey team. My mom caught me last week and I'm grounded for the next 6 months, and I don't love that. You know, finding those motivators and then really playing down the things they like about it and amplifying those things that they dislike can help to move them along that sort of readiness road to want to make a change and to stop using that substance. And then finally, referral to treatment. So I will give the caveat that within School Expert, we are not identifying thousands of kids in Massachusetts who need a referral to treatment. And those kids who do get a referral, for the most part, are not being referred to a detox, right? We're not overwhelming our substance use treatment system as a result of implementing Expert in the schools. The vast majority of kids, and we'll get some data later, are getting positive reinforcement. Some of them are getting brief intervention. For the young people who do need it, referral to treatment is a component of Expert. We want to make sure that, you know, when we do identify a young person who is experiencing difficulty stopping using a substance or who has a substance use disorder, that we're able to get them to treatment. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the systems that make them place in Massachusetts in a little bit, but as a component, referral to treatment is the last step, and there are a lot of options available across the continuum, right? We don't push a one-size-fits-all approach. We want to make sure that, you know, people are getting the right support that they need. So yes, you know, if we identify a young person who is struggling with opioid use, we want to make sure that we get them to a detox for appropriate level of care. But if we're talking to a young person who, you know, talks about struggling a little bit with peer pressure and they've been having a hard time figuring out how to avoid using substances with a certain group of friends, then it might be, rather than a referral to treatment in a classical sense, referring that young person to perhaps the local Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, other sort of community support that's built in that the school already does some work with to make sure that they're building some other positive social bonds. So one of the most commonly used screening tools, just to give you an idea of the questions that get asked, and we have one of these palm cards, I think, in your green folders, is the craft screening tool. And I'm sorry, this is a little bit tough to see, but I'll run through quickly. So in the craft screening,
I think they have a copy in the form of the craft screening in the back.
So it's the white sheet in the back on the left-hand side. You can see the questions revolve around number one: have you ever ridden in a car driven by somebody, including yourself, who was high or having used alcohol or drugs? And that is one of the questions you can imagine that gets the most positive responses when we do the screenings, and that's something that's always dealt with immediately. But the rest of the questions: so do you ever use alcohol or drugs to relax? Have you ever used substances alone? Do you forget things you did while you were using substances? Do your family or friends tell you to stop or cut back? And have you ever gotten in trouble because of your substance use? You can sort of see that these questions geared toward adolescents don't just evaluate whether or not a young person is using substances, because again, I mean, even as an adult, if I come to you and I say, have you been drinking? That's going to put you on the offense immediately, right? That's not helpful. That's not building trust. That's not giving us an opportunity to have a real conversation. Whereas when we're asking the questions in this way, it's less confrontational. and it gives young people the chance to not just think about whether or not they're using substances, but if they are using substances, gives us clues as the screener, the adults they're talking to, so what kind of risky behavior they're engaging in, because we're going to deal with it either way, right? If a young person says yes to using to relax and says, yeah, like sometimes me and my friends from the football team will have a beer on the weekend, just relax, no big deal. It is a big deal, and we're going to have a conversation about that, but that's going to be a much different conversation than the young person who answers yes to the next question using alone, and indicates that they've been smoking in the morning before going to school because the social pressure or the academic pressure is getting to them, right? So those are two different levels of intervention, two different frames for the conversation. So sort of the beauty of ESPER is that it's highly adaptable, gives us the opportunity to have these conversations in a way that, again, is non-confrontational and really lends itself to the way that a young person wants to feel empowered to share their own story from their own perspective and to identify their own motivators for behavior change. So just sort of a flow chart of how it works can get a sense. So, screening, we always reinforce positive behavior. So if you go through all the screening questions, the answers are no, 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 no. We don't just say, okay, great, next. We actually take a couple minutes to have a conversation with that student and say, hey, that's really great. A lot of the schools in Massachusetts have done some social norms marketing campaigns, so they can share very hyper-local data to say, it might feel like you're in the minority, but actually most kids in the 9th grade have not started drinking, using other drugs. So you're actually in the majority. I know that you hear a lot of messages that might make you feel like that's not the case, but you are. And then you can also offer support, offer skill building. And it's a great opportunity, especially in the schools, for the school nurse, guidance counselor, school adjustment counselor, to help to build that relationship with students further and offer themselves as a sort of point of support. If the answer is yes, then you ask additional questions, assess the level of use, and then from there, figure out either the brief intervention or referral to treatment next steps. So why ESPER? We said young people want to talk about substance use. One of the things that we hear over and over again as we talk to folks in different professions who are being trained in ESPER is that they were a little bit skeptical at first, and they have been surprised by how open a lot of young people are about substance use, whether it's theirs or peers. They want to talk about it, they want that feedback, and they want to be able to get good information, right? Because the place that teens go now for information, the place that we all go, right, is into our pocket, we grab our cell phone and we start Googling. And that's not always going to get you the most accurate information. Young people are truthful when they're asked, especially when asked in an appropriate and sensitive manner. Screening is cost effective. It is really inexpensive to train a workforce to go through and use these very easy screening tools. There are tons of materials out there, like those craft interview guides. Those are available for free for any setting that is implementing ESPER with adolescents. There are toolkits out there that are available. It's all very accessible. This isn't something that is making everyone's sexual body rich because they hold all the tools and the keys to the training and all the modules. This is something that is really affordable compared to, especially treatment. Screening tools can guide the conversation. And then universal screening has universal benefits, and that's what I want to take a second just to hammer home. We never single out adolescents for ESPER. So we don't look at a kid and say, I'm going to keep pointing you because you're right here. Like, you, come with me, school nurse's office, we're going to have a conversation because I feel like I've heard some things in the hallways. That's not the approach, right? We would never do that to a student around any other health need. So we're not doing that with substance use. So students are screened universally by age group, right? So Massachusetts, we've designated some grade levels. Those students are going to be called down one at a time by grade to come have that conversation in private, in our case with the school nurse or the guidance counselor. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, not singling anybody out and perpetuating stigma, right? Not labeling kids. And we also want to make sure that everybody's getting the benefit, because a lot of folks think that they know by looking at somebody, that they can tell whether or not something's going on. But we know that time and again, this has been tested, right? With medical doctors, with social workers, with psychologists, who all think with all of their training, they can identify that person just by looking, and we know they can't. Because every study that has been done has shown that you cannot tell things about people just by looking at them. We want to make sure that we're getting this benefit sort of across the population level, and that we're giving all students a chance to have a conversation, build some trust, identify an adult within the school who can offer them support, offer them tools. Even if they haven't started using substances yet, it's an opportunity to sort of build that relationship. So, schools we identified as an ideal setting. We can reach students who may be disconnected from other services and supports. Young people are surrounded by trusted adults and trained professionals in the school setting, and it creates an opportunity to build relationships, as I've been saying, between the students and the staff. And it also creates a shared language, right, within that school community around substance use and substance use disorders, substance misuse. So rather than having sort of everything be a separate module, right, where students are in different class tracks and might be getting different messages from different teachers, this is one way in which we can make sure that on this really important issue, there is a shared language across the school community in how we're talking about substance use, and it really reframes it, right, from something that can be stigmatized, brushed aside, not talked about in the school community, to something that is dealt with like any other health issue. Most of the schools that are doing this in Massachusetts are incorporating it into the weeks where they're already doing the school health screenings that get done. There's EMI, scoliosis screenings, which we still do in Massachusetts. I don't know if here. Vision, hearing, dental. So they just incorporate that right in there, and it seamlessly blends in like all of the other health screenings that are already being done, and it sort of normalizes the conversation. Is there a question of me?
Yes. Parental blessing and informed consent. How are you addressing that?
So we're going to get there.
Okay.
We're going to talk a lot about that. So I will get into a little bit around the design of the work here. I want to play a quick video for you all on the school expert program in Massachusetts, and then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of how this all came to be and what some of the project design looks like, but I wanted to give you a nice little snapshot. And I apologize if this is very loud for a second. Is that loud enough? Good.
Good morning, Dylan. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. As you know, we're meeting with all the 10th graders during gym class this month to talk a little bit about how drugs and alcohol affect health, safety, and certainly academic performance.
Asking about substance use is an important part of keeping adolescents healthy. School nurses and health teams have a unique opportunity to engage with students and serve as a trusted resource within the school settings. SBIRT is a method being used in schools throughout Massachusetts to screen and intervene for unhealthy substance use. I'm going to give you a copy to look along with, okay? So, during the past 12 months, on how many days did you drink more than a few sips of beer, wine, or any drink containing alcohol? The process uses validated screening tools paired with a structured conversation meant to elicit honest responses and evoke motivation to make behavioral changes. SBIRT utilizes many processes and protocols that are already in place in schools for other wellness screenings. This video will walk you through some ideas on how SBIRT was implemented in one Massachusetts community and give you ideas about implementing it in your school.
Hey, Brian.
different models of implementation have been successfully used. Some schools have used health or PE class as a time to do individual screenings. Others have included ESPER as part of their routine health screenings. Whichever method you choose to engage students, the following key elements can lead to success. Establish an ESPER team that includes nurses, counselors, and other healthcare professionals. Administrators should also be engaged in the ESPER planning and implementation. Allow for adequate time and private space for individual interactions. Ensure the results of the screening and the content of the conversation are kept confidential. Screening involves 4 validated questions to determine if a student has used any alcohol or drugs in the past year. If the student does not acknowledge any substance use, the first question of the CRAFT screening tool, also known as the CAR question, is then asked. The majority of teens will screen negative and should be engaged in a brief conversation to praise healthy choices and encourage continuation of healthy and safe behaviors.
I'm really pleased too about your decisions about drugs and alcohol at this point. Do you have any other questions for me today? Anything else I can help you with?
For those students who screen positive, the CRAFT screening tool is then asked. Do you ever use alcohol or drugs to relax, feel better about yourself, kind of fit in?
Well, a few weeks ago I was out with some of the hockey team and we were just kind of hanging out and some of them were drinking and I had some too.
The brief negotiated interview outlines a structured conversation using principles of motivational interviewing. The emphasis of this conversation is on the impact that the substances are having on the student's life. The conversation is non-judgmental and is guided by the student's own reasons for making a change.
So Brian, you were saying that you enjoyed being with the guys and having a few drinks and having fun. On the same token, you were telling me that you're concerned that you forgot a few things from that evening and that you didn't feel good the next day.
Like not being able to remember stuff is kind of scary. And also I'm trying to play hockey in college, so that's really important to me.
For those students who score high on the CRAFT and indicate the need for further assessment, talking with the student about their own motivation to make healthier choices will enhance the student's engagement in the process. When an external referral is recommended, current school procedures should be followed. Would you like to be in the room with me while I call them? I mean, I guess so.
We froze.
Okay, so let's give them a call. Parents may be involved in the referral process. Sample scripts are available to guide these discussions. So let me just talk to your mom first, and then I'll put her on speakerphone if this is an okay time for her to talk. Finally, nurses should keep personal notes that are not a part of the student's health or educational record. So you guys got my email with the group of students that you're each gonna screen to make sure there's no conflict of interest or anything like that. School health teams can play a critical role in engaging students in discussions about their alcohol and/or drug use.
Do you have any other questions for me today?
I guess I just had one. I'm just kind of curious.
Screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment is a tool that can be integrated into health and wellness efforts at schools to address teen substance use. ESPER in schools, asking questions, improving student health and safety.
All right. Thanks for the lights. So that's our health team at Native Public Schools. They were one of the pilot sites. So as I mentioned, for all these reasons, we identified schools as an ideal place to increase the number of young people who are sort of being exposed to the benefit of ESPER at the population level within their school environment. We were lucky enough in Massachusetts when we started looking around to be able to talk to folks at our State Department of Public Health about a pilot that I had initiated a couple years prior at at the time, 3 public high schools in Massachusetts, Natick being one of the first round to implement SBIRT in 1 grade level. By the time that we actually proposed legislation, there were 7 school districts that had implemented, and by the time the bill I'm going to talk about passed, there were 10 school districts that were either currently utilizing SBIRT through the school health team or were in the process of training to implement. So the design basically looked like what you just saw. The school nurse was really the center of the school health team who was charged with doing the initial screening. From there, things get very adaptable. So there are some districts where there is a school nurse and maybe 1 guidance counselor, and that is it. And so for students who did need a brief intervention, depending on the number, that would get split up. Either the school nurse would take that on, or the guidance counselor, or they would divide that work up. And other districts have more robust staff. Some have a substance use counselor, some have a school adjustment counselor. They would take part in that. And of course, some of our schools have a school-based health center attached. And they were also able to get creative and sort of work them in as part of the school health team to help to divide up that work as well. And I think one of the lessons that we really learned and had driven home over and over again through this process was that if school SBIRT is going to work, it has to be as adaptable as anything else that we do in the schools, because school districts vary widely. We are a state with 405 school districts. We don't work on a county model in Massachusetts, so things either happen statewide or town by town, city by city. So it's really important to us to be able to take these lessons learned and apply them at the state level, but to make sure it remained flexible enough that the school districts could implement without it being a burden, because what's going to work in Natick Public Schools, which is a mid-size district outside of Boston by about an hour, that's not going to work so well in a rural town on Cape Cod or a rural town out on the islands or in Western Massachusetts, and it's also certainly not going to work in one of our major cities like Boston, Springfield, and Worcester, where we have very different student population, very different staffing structure, very different resources available. So we couldn't pursue a one-size-fits-all approach. One of the things that we were able to talk about universally, though, was parental consent and student consent. So there are 2 levels of consent. Within the pilot sites, of the first 8 that implemented, 7 districts did an opt-out. So parents need to be notified in Massachusetts anytime. I suspect this is the case in any state. I'm not an education policy expert, but parents need to be notified anytime you're doing something health and wellness related with their child. So schools had to include a notice home to parents with adequate time to respond if they did not want their student to be screened. The notifications all include the list of questions that the students are asked, so that it's not scary, so that parents know what those questions are. Some of the schools actually encourage parents to review those questions with their kids before they actually come in for the screening. The schools are also encouraged to make a staff person available who's gone through SBIRT training to talk to parents if they have any questions or concerns. The schools, I think, have found the same thing that we have as advocates, which is that 99% of the questions that I get about SBIRT from folks who are scared of it those fears can be assuaged with information, right? Walking folks through the process, letting them see, like with videos like this, what SBIRT looks like in practice, that we're not asking to do blood draws, that we're not testing kids for substance use, that we're just having a conversation, building relationships within the school, helping kids know who they can go to if they have questions about substance use or if they have concerns about themselves or somebody else. One of the districts did do a opt-in to parental consent. I believe they had in year 1, 65% of parents opt their kids into screening, which is a really good return rate for anything with the school districts looking for opt-in, which they were encouraged by. There was also a turnover after year one in that school district with their general counsel. So the interpretation of the new council for that school district actually interpreted the guidance differently and said, oh no, we don't have to do an opt-in, we can do an opt-out, as the other districts have interpreted it. And that's what's happening in the majority of districts in Massachusetts now, that are doing an opt-out. So parents are notified in advance of the screening, they're given the information, and overwhelmingly they don't respond or respond positively saying, thanks for doing this. So there have not been many cases of parents opting their kids out, which is encouraging. And we'll look at another example of data on that in a little bit. So with that pilot model in mind and with the need to be flexible, developed legislation and really have been talking about this from the perspective of the schools, right? Giving schools the tools that they need to prevent substance use. We've changed the language since developing these little cards, but we use these as little handouts at the State House during bill debates, and also use them as infographics on social media. There's a whole suite of these, but really framed it as making sure that we were empowering the place that we send our kids every day to make sure that they have all the tools at their disposal that they need and the resources to be able to use them properly. So we developed a dual strategy. We looked to the state budget. We wanted to make sure that we had funding in place to add additional districts at the rate that they were going, adding about 2 new school districts per year. I would have been very old by the time we got through the majority of school districts in Massachusetts, with 405 out there and, growing a little bit year after year. And of course, there's also that point, right, where you run out of the low-hanging fruit districts that are clamoring for these resources and want to implement. Then it gets a little more difficult without a limit in place. So we requested $40,000 to support 10 new districts. That was actually successfully incorporated into the budget before any legislation passed. And that $40,000 that could support 10 districts for some more intensive pilot implementation, we saw 105 school districts apply for those resources. So that really, I think, underscored the need for this and the desire amongst the school districts to get these tools, because they felt that they weren't getting anything else. They recognized that substance use was an issue within the school environment or within their broader city and town, but they didn't have the resources to have conversations in a way that they were confident was constructive with students.
I have a question. So for districts who have really high drug use and very limited resources, what kind of community support are we looking to lean on there for when we have to refer the kids somewhere? Is there going to be enough support for those kids?
So one of the things that the Department of Public Health incorporated into the planning process for the districts is there's actually in your folders an implementation checklist. So the school districts are all offered, forcing them to utilize it, but the vast majority are. They are offered training through the Department of Public Health, who work with the Massachusetts Expert Training and Technical Assistance team at Boston University to train the school health teams in Expert. And they also provide technical assistance. So they've taken all of the learning from the pilot sites and have been utilizing that to actually coach the districts through the implementation process. So there's a lot of that goes into place to make sure that there's a tailored local approach. So that individual district is going to sit down with staff from DPH and look through an implementation plan. Actually, that is in there as well, to figure out exactly what those local resources are. So this is where it gets into sort of the art and the tailored approach versus having something universal. So for a district that really is expecting that they're going to have a high number of positives, there's going to be a lot more work done there to make sure that they're assessing what local resources there are in place, to make sure that they know what they're going to do, what their plan is when they identify a student who is using substances and needs to be referred for treatment, for counseling, for whatever the appropriate level of care is. But again, I'll stress what we have found is that we want to get to, so we want to target appropriately, right? So we don't want to be having this conversation with students who are already using substances on a whole, right? We want to make sure that we're targeting this young enough that we're reaching kids before they use. This is really about prevention and early intervention. So if we're getting a high number of positives, and these are kids who don't just need a referral to fill their time and give them something sort of constructive or to help them build their skills around avoiding social situations where they feel pressure to use. If we're identifying kids who need substance use disorder treatment, then we want at that point to make sure that we're adjusting, right? That we're reaching kids at a younger grade.
So what grade level are you doing it with?
So the
Several or just?
yeah, so the bill that we filed requires all schools to screen for substance use using a validated tool. The original language that we pushed for called for screening in 2 grade levels. The first time around could be in 8th or 9th grade at the discretion of the school district, and the second was going to be in 11th grade. This is not what we ended up going with in the final bill. The way that we got this was me calling and having conversations with folks from the Adolescent Substance Abuse Program at Boston Children's Hospital, at Boston Medical Center, their Adolescent Substance Use Treatment Unit, and then with about 5 other experts in the field of adolescent substance use. And let me tell you, I am pretty sure I could have called 100 different experts in adolescent substance use, and the scatter plot of what ages we should do expert at would be like this. So we essentially took an average of the age level that they encouraged us to go with, and this was where we landed. Again, when we initially filed the bill, that evolved, and I'll talk a little about that in a minute. But sort of with the initial filing of the bill, in addition to calling for the screening twice, we also required that the districts report de-identified data back to the Department of Public Health to make sure that we were monitoring how implementation was going and that we could observe those trends. We also made sure that screening results were not going to be reported as part of the student's record. That had been something that was part of the pilot protocols, but we really wanted to make sure that that piece was part of the law that passed. Because expert should never be used as an instrument of targeting students for discipline. That is a major concern. That was something that we heard from parents, from community members, from youth that we were working with, and from school staff, basically every direction. Yes.
Okay, so what about expert being used as a tool to help parents spy on their children? So I'm being serious though, in the sense of like, that's my biggest concern listening to all of this. It's a great, awesome program for high schools, but working in a high school myself, my first fear is you're putting an awful lot of faith, I guess, in the people who are your guidance counselors and the people who are screening, because one person's idea of what needs screening and treatment and another person's idea of what needs screening and treatment. So that line between when this stays confidential and when we call the parents, that line is so sticky in a high school. And also with something like this, liability. So I'm the counselor that's doing the intake, and I determine that this is just, normal, you know what I mean, like it's not to that level, and then something happens to the kid. They know that I did this screening. Am I liable for that decision that I just made?
So this is something that in the training sessions, there's a lot of time spent on this because it's sticky. Mm-hmm. It's a thin line in a lot of cases, and it relies, right, on the professional judgment of the healthcare professional in the school. But that's the thing we keep coming back to, right, is that with every other health decision, with all the other screenings that we have our school nurses do, we trust their professional judgment that they are going to do the screening or they're going to have a conversation with my kid if they come into the office. And if they need to contact me, or if they need to refer my kid to an outside professional, they're going to do that. But if their professional judgment says that that's not what's needed right now, they don't do that. One of the important things about SBIRT in the school environment is that we have the ability to do a callback, right? So we have that kid in school. Kids are not super mobile, right? Most kids who start the school year in that district are going to finish it there, and even more likely they're going to be back next school year. So if you're building that relationship, if you have concerns as a professional about that child's well-being, you have the opportunity to keep an eye on the kid, to check back with them. We love the idea of physicians utilizing SBIRT more frequently with the adolescents that they're treating or in their care. But if the pediatrician has a conversation with a young person about their substance use that remains confidential, but they have some concerns that they're not going to share with mom or dad who's sitting in the waiting room right now, it's a lot harder for that kid to go back in 3 months or even 3 weeks for a check-in with their pediatrician, because one, if they're 14, they can't drive. The likelihood that most kids live in a place where they can jump on a train or a bus to go to their pediatrician is slim to none. And they all, what are you going to say? I have a cold, I need to go back to Dr. Jones today at 3, I have an appointment. Like, that's not gonna work out so well. So with the schools, the school nurse does have the ability, or guidance counselor, to say, all right, we have our plan in place, I've expressed my concern, I'm gonna set a time for you to come back down to see me in 3 weeks, in 1 month. They can do sort of that targeting and have them come back to see how things have progressed. Yeah, I mean, I totally have empathy for the perspective you're coming from. It is one of the most robust conversations that happens during the trainings. But I think one of the things that we've heard from the trainers is that they remind the school nurses who are being trained, like, this is something you've been empowered to do already. In theory, you could already be doing these screenings. You have the skill set. This is a tool that is in your tool belt. You could have gone to any training to learn how to use motivational interviewing with the students to talk about substance use, mental health, other positive behavior change. So just because we're doing this with every student, formally.
But the thing is, even though we're doing it informally, we're still fighting over those conversations, so you found out that this young person is smoking marijuana 3 times a month and you didn't tell their parents, you know what I mean? So
yeah, I mean,
I see.
Certainly. I think the thing that we keep coming back to and that we need to remind ourselves of is that it feels dicey, but it's the right thing to do, to be having these conversations. And if we're not having them with these kids, who is? We don't have guarantees that there's somebody else at home, in the community, in their doctor's office, who's having this conversation with them.
So the child decides whether you call the parents or not?
No, so that's a very good question. So if the way that the final legislation shakes out, if there is an emergent or urgent need to contact the child's parent or guardian, then the school nurse tells the child, I feel that you are in imminent danger, that your health is threatened, or the well-being of others, if it's yes to the card question, is imminently threatened by your substance use. So I'm going to contact mom, dad, grandma, whoever it is at home, and then the student has the opportunity to decide either I'd like to sit in, and this depends on the school's policy as well, but for the most part, it's the student gets to decide if they want to be present for that conversation and be part of it, or if they want to step out and let the school nurse make that call on their own.
Because they are minors, so the parents have a legal right to know what's going on. It's like if you screen your kid for cancer and they came up positive, you wouldn't keep that from the parents.
So, yes, and so if it rises to the level of this student substance use indicates that they may have a substance use disorder and we need to refer them for treatment or for further assessment, then at that point, definitely going to contact the guardians at home. If it is, and I don't like this expression, but sort of clinically what could be termed age-appropriate experimentation, then in that case, again, you're going to use the brief intervention, you're going to rely on all of those tools, right, to get the student to a point where they're willing to commit to cutting back or stopping their substance use altogether. You're going to have them set a 3-week callback so that they come back to you to check in on how that's going. You write down what strategies they're going to use to avoid substance use, and you check back in. Oftentimes, the school nurse will encourage the student to fill their parents in on what's happening. They will offer to help them make that phone call, to help them have that conversation. But at that point, if there isn't an immediate concern for the child's safety and well-being, they're not going to force them to call mom and dad. And again, this is really asking health professionals, right, to rely on their own
Well, they see them every day, all day
judgment.
long, so
Exactly.
there's probably a better position.
What's been the response from parents where, in places where you have implemented this?
So for the most part, parents have been really excited about this, and we have some strong community coalitions in Massachusetts who have been really helpful in that regard in helping to make sure that sort of the parent community knows that this is coming, that this is a good thing. I think the biggest thing that folks have gotten concerned about, this happened in the legislature, and it has happened with parents in some cities and towns, is that we're asking to drug test kids, and that kids are going to get in trouble.
The misperception that that's what's going on.
So again, it comes back to the concerns that folks have about SBIRT are 99.9% of the time able to be assuaged by having this conversation, understanding what SBIRT really is, seeing what it looks like, being able to watch a video of what the screenings look like.
What happens in a situation where the alcohol use is like one of the parents is like, if there's a student, you know, a nurse finds out that a student there's a lot of alcohol use like in their home.
So that is one of the things that comes up
Yeah.
a lot in these conversations and has come up a lot in the screenings. It comes up most around the car question. Have you been in a car driven by somebody who was under the influence of alcohol or other drugs? And what we have seen, so what a lot of districts have done in that case, or have planned within their implementation planning, is if the student says, you know, my parent, this is a real example, my parent picks me up drunk almost every single day after school. So that school nurse got a school administrator who was watching those students come and go from the lot to actually pay attention to the parents coming and going that day, and they identified the parent of that student who was driving erratically. As I pulled them to the lot, had a conversation with them. The police got involved because they were driving drunk and they weren't going to let the student get in that car. And these, I mean, these are big deal things, right? But they were able to deal with it in a way that didn't put the student on the spot for ratting out their parents.
Wonderful, really, actually.
But they were able to intervene. I mean, school nurses, all school personnel, right, are mandated reporters. So if they receive information that indicates that the child's well-being is in danger at home, they are required to file a 51A and report that. Well, in Massachusetts, 51A, I'm not sure what it's called here, but file a report with the State Department of Children and Families.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. So, for kids who identify sort of their parents' substance use at home, or a guardian, or older sibling, if there is a concern for the child's well-being, school faculty, school nurses, as mandated reporters, do need to file a report at that point in time. But again, this comes back to the training that all school personnel received, right, around being a mandated reporter and identifying what that line is. And these are things that, of course, are human, are sticky, and are fine lines sometimes, but it's They're not adding an additional layer, right? This is asking folks to rely on that training that they've received as professionals to make the calls that they need to make. So, you know, this has certainly, in a state with an opioid crisis, come up as an issue. There have been a few students in some hands who have identified their parents' substance use. But that's also incredibly valuable for the school health team to know, right? So this isn't something, again, that's being shared across the school community. This is a conversation that's private between the school nurse or school guidance counselor and the student. So they're having this conversation one-on-one. As they mentioned in that video, none of this information is being recorded in the student's school record. Any notes that the school nurse keeps must be kept in their personal files, which are not accessible to anyone in the school administration and the educators who see that student. It is a personal note for themselves to keep for future interactions with that student.
As far as the de-identified data, are they being collected?
Yeah,
How's that being collected?
So that is being collected at our Department of Public Health, and that is also being sort of cross-referenced over time with our Youth Risk Behavior Survey data, which we're also hopefully utilizing in some of the districts to target. I'll talk a little bit more about that.
You mentioned earlier in the presentation that sometimes you may have to go down to the emergency room. How is that connected with the hospitals and who actually initiates the call and what protocol connecting the dots? How is it actually initiated?
So if a student is identified who has sort of an emergent need to be connected to treatment because they've been identified as having a substance disorder, so you're probably not going to the emergency room at that point. What the school nurse is going to do, because they've done a screening, right, not an assessment. So the school nurse, if that is the case and they've identified a student who is at really high risk, that is when it triggers the phone call home to the parent or guardian, and then you talk through with the family, here are the resources, here's what I'm suggesting, here's the referral that I want to make for your student, and it's conversation back and forth. And that's the case anytime, you know, someone brought the example of if your child is screened and you identify another health issue, you're going to call home to mom and dad and make sure that you're having that conversation and making sure the parent knows what's going on. And from there, being able to make your decisions about how to proceed. So the parent's going to be engaged in that conversation. It's not going to be the school nurse alone making a referral and sending the kid off, and you got to pick up your kid at the end of the day and send the kid. We're not putting
right now. Yeah, I was addressing that scenario that you mentioned that a youth goes to the emergency room, broke an ankle.
So ESPER was initially developed for use in emergency departments, but that's not necessarily connected directly. So that's just the evolution of ESPER. So it started being used in emergency departments to identify folks more as an assessment tool who they already thought were abusing a substance, and that was how they ended up in the emergency department in the first place. Whereas in the schools, we're using this universally, so we're not targeting students.
It's just as important in knowing what ESPER is, knowing what ESPER is not, and being that it's not a diagnostic tool. I'm wondering, was there specific language in the legislation that made that distinction, that this is not a diagnostic tool, even for someone who screens at high risk? They haven't met clinical criteria for having a substance use disorder. I think that often confuses people. I worked on the New Jersey ESPER project for 5 years, and people have that misconception that it's a diagnostic tool and that ESPER is administered by clinicians, when in fact it's not. It's a screening tool only. So did the legislation address that specifically?
So the legislation, the way that everything is worded, we couldn't put that in there. That kind of clarification can't go in, but it is clarified within there that the screenings must be conducted using a validated screening tool approved by the Department of Public Health. And that's really intended to make it clear, you know, for the folks at the school districts who need to interpret the guidance that comes down from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, that this is not an opportunity to implement a diagnostic tool, which they don't want to do anyway.
Right,
But
right.
it's very clear for the way that it's worded that this has to be implementation of a screening tool that is validated, it's been tested and approved for use of adolescents. And then, you know, we've also tried to strengthen that through the confidentiality language. Make sure it's very clear, you know, this is not something that is diagnosing the student as having a substance use disorder, and so that does, you know, on the end of legal obligation and liability, you haven't diagnosed a student. You have assessed them to be engaging in risky behavior, and depending on the level of risk, you may or may not find it appropriate to contact their parent. And again, that comes back to making sure that we're making sure that our school health professionals feel empowered to rely on their years of experience and their professional judgment to make those calls. But that has been one of the big things we've had to clarify over time. So not as much with the school health teams who really get it because this is their niche, but certainly with legislators and parents that we're not diagnosing students in school.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've struggled with is the acronym. I hate that referral to treatment portion of the acronym because you're not really referring someone for substance abuse treatment, because you haven't determined that they have a substance use disorder. You're really referring for additional assessment. So I really wish it was
SBRA.
Because when you see treatment, you feel like, okay, now I'm a diagnostician and I've determined the student to be, you know, to have a substance use disorder, which changes the game completely. So I've often struggled with that.
And who's doing the further evaluations by the way?
So that depends on the referral plan, right, for the district, the referral for assessment.
Because, I mean, I lived in Tom's River when my son was going through this, and it was really pathetic. You know, we were given a list here, call this person, and call that person, and that's not the person you want to talk to, so now you hit a dead wall, or you hit a brick wall. And, you know, like you said, people in the community support, there was like no big brothers, big sisters in the county. There was no support. So I think this is fantastic. And I actually had developed the screening tool myself before I came here to see how you did it. But the thing is, what happens next? Like, the kids really, some of these kids really need some intervention. And not that they're diagnosed with a substance abuse problem, but the potential is there. And when the potential is there, you know, you have to act on it in some way, because if you don't, then you're looking at for other problems down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. We really want to make sure that we're taking advantage of this opportunity for that early intervention, right? We've identified beginning of use. We want to make sure that we are addressing that and that we're connecting kids to the right resources. So a big piece of the implementation plan is identifying those resources locally that we are going to rely on. And this is an opportunity, you know, most school districts actually have these connections already in place, right? They have their local pediatricians, they have their local boys and girls clubs or other youth groups that they're aware of that they can get students connected to. And they know the local community health center, the local hospital system, because there are kids with other health needs, whether it's behavioral or physical health, that they are already connected with in some way. So this is building further relationships within that community to make sure that, you know, those kids who identified as having struggle with substance use are also being linked into that stream of connection. And not to say that that is already perfect. As somebody who works on the kids' mental health side as well, there are certainly a lot of things ongoing that we're working on, making sure that kids in schools are getting access to the appropriate behavioral health treatment that they need. Has been a struggle at times, but things have certainly improved. And I think the more that we can draw those connections between physical health, mental health, and substance use, the easier it's going to be in the long run to make sure those streams are more seamless.
If I could, maybe if I would suggest that we let Courtney get to, she's got several slides left. why don't we let her get through the rest of her presentation? There will be some time for some more questions. We do also want to talk to you about the legislation that we've already introduced here in New Jersey. So if we could just, maybe if you think you're going to forget it, just, I know I often do, just write it down. And if you could refer back to this slide, but why don't we let her get through the rest of the presentation, and then we'll take some more questions.
This is the quick part, so I'll fly through these next few and then we'll have more time. It's a good discussion. So we were able to get ESPR incorporated into an omnibus opioid bill back in late 2015, which changed some of the initial language that we talked about. So I mentioned some changes earlier. There was a change reflected to clarify that screenings may include questions regarding tobacco use as long as it's using a screen approved by BPH. We changed the language a few times. It went from 8th or 9th and then 11th grade to 7th and 10th grade to it was 7th or 9th and then 12th, based on different folks weighing in. What we finally landed on was that screenings would happen in 2 grade levels to be determined by the Department of Public Health and the school district in consultation with one another. And what this really allows us to do is more local targeting. So again, you know, I've said the beauty of ESPR is how adaptable it is, and the most important piece of school ESPR is keeping it flexible. Some of our school districts have really amazing local data, right? And I suspect the same is the case in New Jersey. We have a couple of community foundations in Massachusetts that have funded sort of a more in-depth youth risk behavior survey at the local level. So we can actually go in and pinpoint that we see a jump in first use of a substance between 9th and 10th grade in town-wide over here. So, okay, we're going to target the lower grade level for ESPR and see if that has an impact on the number of kids who indicate first use next time we do this survey in that jump. And then for those districts that don't have that more localized data, we still have the youth risk behavior survey every few years, and we're able to do a little more targeting that way. And then we also have strength and confidentiality language in the opioid bill, as we call it. So that just ensured that the information collected from the screenings was not going to be tied to the student, was not going to be accessible by the administration, and that parents would only be contacted in the case where there was an emergent need to connect their kid to resources or a significant concern about their immediate well-being. There's always a little bit of pushback. We saw both our Speaker of the House chime in with the press concerned that screening students for substance use was going to raise constitutional issues. And the governor also expressed reservations about the screening plan. What he didn't realize was that the proposal that had been incorporated into the bill was actually the school screening measure that was included in our governor's opioid task force recommendations. Because it's very easy, right? When we hear certain words like screening and substance use and students all together, our brain goes to your drug testing kids, which is what both of them thought. Because it's difficult when they're hearing about this without the advocates working on it in the room, right? To make sure that they're getting a clear picture of what they're being asked to pass into law. So, and I totally understand that, because if someone came to me as an advocate around children's mental health and said, we're going to start drug testing kids in schools, we want you to support this policy, I would say no way. Because that is stigmatizing, it's harmful, it's punishment driven, right? So we took those comments. Well, first, pop quiz. Does ESPR include biological or chemical drug testing? So, took a public and private approach. We had an op-ed co-signed by an expert in adolescent substance use treatment and our legislative champion. We made a big social media push targeting legislators, we had a briefing at the State House with an SBIRT demo, which I think above anything else that we did was the most instrumental in making sure that school SBIRT is passed into law today. And we also got a lot of constituent calls and emails and did direct outreach to legislative leadership and the administration, whether that was through getting constituents we were close with to make a personal phone call to the speaker or the governor, or sending messages through sort of our own channels as advocates to make sure they reached them in a way that was comfortable for everybody. It certainly would not have benefited us to call out the speaker and the governor in the paper. It was much more constructive for us to just make sure that we were able to get them the information that they needed to understand that this is not what we're calling for, that we agree with them entirely. Yeah, let's not violate kids' constitutional rights by drug testing them in schools. We think that's a bad idea too. But there is this screening tool we can use to have conversations with them, and that actually has been shown to help put off first use, so let's go with that. Everyone was happy. The governor came out in the paper saying that he was okay with screening for substance use. I like the sort of non sequitur subheading there. And we also had the Speaker of the House on the floor tell the House members that he was very supportive of the idea of training schools to have conversations with students as opposed to drug testing. So this was really a big shift in the way that we were addressing the opioid crisis in Massachusetts, though we really like to frame SBIRT more broadly than substance use prevention and early intervention. Within the context of the opioid crisis, we had passed a landmark bill the session previous that really dealt with treatment and recovery, which was sorely needed. We still need further reforms in Massachusetts because we need to make sure that people have access to the treatment and recovery services that they need. But we're fighting an uphill battle, and that's not going to get any better by making Narcan our major prevention push, which it had been up until this point. So in the previous bill, increased utilization of Narcan was really lauded as this big prevention victory. And while we are preventing people from losing their lives by utilizing Narcan, we're not actually preventing young people from utilizing substances and from potentially developing a substance use disorder. So we're not actually stemming the tide, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a giant open wound, right? So this was really a shift for us. They called the law the Substance Abuse Treatment, Education, and Prevention Act, and it included the provision to screen all students in schools at 2 grade levels with that strengthened confidentiality language and with the assurance that nothing would be recorded in the student's school record. The big piece I should mention here, because I know funding is important, is that these 3 little words were also included at the end of that section of the law, subject to appropriation. Show of hands, who knows what those words mean? An advocate's least favorite. But like any law that passes, we can't have unfunded mandates, right? So anything that is passed into law for the schools is subject to appropriation. So shorthand, if there is no money allocated for school districts to do this, they are not obligated to implement SBIRT. So we were glad that we had gotten that $40,000 implemented so we could at least get a few districts up and running. Implementation is now underway. So we were able to successfully advocate for $1.1 million in a supplemental budget that passed shortly after the bill. So that funded the first year of training and implementation in school districts. That's training, technical assistance, and the one thing that schools said that they really needed support with was hiring a per diem school nurse as a sub when this regular school nurse was doing the screenings. They wanted to make sure the regular school nurse was the one doing the screenings because that gives them the ability to build that relationship with the students in the school rather than having somebody from the outside do it. but they needed somebody to cover the school nurse's desk to make sure that asthma medication, everything else was taken care of during those times. So some of the funding was utilized for that. We were successful in getting another 1.1 million in this most recent fiscal year to continue implementation. Now we have about 250 new school districts implementing end of last school year, beginning of this school year. Over 2,200 individuals have been trained in SBIRT. So the schools are encouraged to send a team of folks to the trainings. There are 2 trainings. There are some modules online. I'll show you the website shortly where you can find tons of resources if you want to dig further into how this is being done in different Massachusetts schools. But the schools are sending, the school health team, so school nurse, guidance counselors, school adjustment counselors, anyone who's going to be involved in implementing SBIRT on their team. They're also often sending an administrator, a teacher. Parents have actually been invited by some districts to go sit in, members of the PTA, or training module 1, which is really talking about what SBIRT is, how it fits into the school environment. So they kind of go for that morning 101. And then when it gets time to learn how to use the screening tool and do motivational interviewing, then it's really just the core teams getting that skill building.
Are there any other requirements for someone to implement this outside of just going through the training?
Nope. So they just have to go through so they have the training, technical assistance through the Department of Public Health. But beyond that, the only requirement is that the funding is in place for them to be able to support it in the school environment.
How long does the training typically take?
So the first training is in 8 hours. It's a full day. So the first half is where we have the broader sort of school team coming in for about SBIRT and how it fits in. And the second half of that day, they start getting into the skills. And then the second module, I believe, is 4 hours. And that is a deeper dive into motivational interviewing, how brief interventions work, and a lot more of that conversation around professional judgment and what constitutes the need to inform parents, all of that.
Are any school districts using just a computerized questionnaire as opposed to a conversation or discussion?
Yeah, so there are, sort of. There are some districts that have the screening tool that they're using loaded onto iPads so that students can answer the questions by tapping on the screen, and then they hand it back to the screener, and they actually get a nice little sort of guide on the screen based on the students' answers to how to conduct the follow-up. That's a resource that we would love to see every school have access to. At this point in time, that's a little bit of a costly proposition. The thing that's really important about classic SBIRT is that it's extremely cost effective. I mean, 2.2 million to provide training and technical assistance and some staffing support to 405 districts is a really lean investment, and that cost is actually going to go down. So this, by the end of this school year, all school districts are required to have implemented SBIRT. And we've gotten most of them trained at this point. Not all of them have started implementation. That cost is going to go down. So we're not going to be advocating for 1.1 million a year every single year for SBIRT because the turnover with school nurses is also pretty low. So we're essentially going to be training to turnover and doing boosters, which is a lot easier than training 405 school districts in how to implement SBIRT. So the cost is going to be reduced over time.
Do they have to go back to the trainings at after a certain amount of years or something like that to get refreshed on anything?
Nope, so there's not a specific certification around SBIRT, but there are lots of resources available in the state. There's also training modules online that are available. You'll find them on the website that'll pop up in a few. So that, if someone wants to go online, they're going to need a refresher course before they do SBIRT that year, but they don't have a day to go dedicate, they can spend a little bit of time going through one of these online training modules to get a little bit of a booster. And those will be available over time. So just wanted to share quickly one snapshot. This is a smaller school district. There are 46 kids in 10th grade. It's a small town. But just to give you an idea of the breakdown, because this is pretty typical, DPH has used this to sort of exemplify how things break down. Of 46 students, no parents opted out. Students have the opportunity to opt out, which is in the bill specifically. You cannot force a student to have this conversation because that's really not going to be helpful, right? If the goal of this is to have it be a dance, not a wrestle. If we're forcing kids to answer questions, not going to be helpful. So 3 students opted out, 43 were screened, 42 of them received positive reinforcement, even though there were 8 pre-interventions, right? So it's really important that we're acknowledging, you know, I hear that you have been experimenting a little bit with drinking, think about it. Here's some positive reinforcement around the fact that you're 16 and just making that decision now and that you're opening up to me about it. And I really appreciate you being willing to be honest with me. So giving that positive reinforcement, but then still making sure that we're addressing the behavior. And in this particular district, there was only one referral to either guidance team or an outside resource. The school nurse was asked to keep track of how long this was taken because one of the concerns, right, is are we going to be overburdening the school health teams? For kids who exhibited no risk, 5 minutes in and out, which is great, right? Because we already said in the beginning, just asking these questions has been shown in clinical settings to put off first use by up to another year. So that means in 5 minutes, we're asking a few questions, giving some positive reinforcement, and that can help actually delay that student's substance use. Quick, easy, cost efficient. And we've also built a relationship with that student who you may not have talked to before. With a brief intervention, they have an additional 10 minutes, and for a student who needs a referral, that's another 5 minutes. Some of the things before I talk about this that we heard. So we've been collecting some feedback from the school nurses and from students. So just a couple of quotes to highlight. These from the school nurses first. I was so nervous, but now I realize it was fun. I like the one-to-one education time with kids. It was nice getting to know more of the kids in my school, and I think we're making a difference. And then 4 of the students who they asked for feedback, the first said, "It's nice to know somebody has your back. I'll visit the school nurse in the future. I felt there was someone I could be honest with and that my privacy was respected. The discussion was helpful. I will change my substance use in the future." And the last student said, "I found somebody I can go to for help when I need it. They listened and were non-judgmental." That's sort of a sampling from a few of the districts of the feedback that they've gotten. So there is a large library of resources. That video that I showed you earlier was one of a series. They're all on here. It's massbert.org/schools. So MassBert, the Massachusetts Training and Technical Assistance Program, have been doing all of the trainings with the school health teams. And they've also done above and beyond and built this for positive information. The bill language is there if anyone's interested in seeing that. More videos, training modules. You have a couple of resources in your folders. There's an implementation planning guide and also the expert planning checklist. So these are tools that were developed for school districts to figure out how to best implement given the unique structure of your district. So you can find those and many more resources on that page. So I think I just want to highlight that's there for those of you who are interested from a school perspective. There are some presentations from the field. So these are some presentations that have been given by school nurse leaders who have driven implementation within their schools. So they're already doing it, have gotten their teams trained, and are a couple years into the process of doing expert, and their reflections are in there. I think that's really helpful to see their perspective. There's also a list of the contact information for all of the pilot sites. So the school nurse leaders who were sort of at the forefront of implementing expert in Massachusetts have all graciously made themselves available for folks who have questions, and I'm sure would welcome contact from folks here. there are questions about what implementation looked like on the ground, sort of school to school. All right, so I'm happy to take questions. I'm sure all right, Ed, you went up first, so I'll.
Okay, I was going to just ask quickly, are there any school districts in Massachusetts that are so sold on the idea that they began implementing it without waiting for funding?
Yeah, there were a few districts that went to local community foundations. We have the Metro West Health Foundation in Massachusetts, and they have supported some districts who wanted to implement but didn't have funding in place through DPH yet. And then we actually had several of our district attorneys' offices offer resources to school districts that were interested in implementing ESPER before the mandate was in place. And they supported some districts in doing that ahead of the mandate.
What about a staffing question? One thing we get all the time is, sounds like a great idea, but we have one staff person, one SAC, for example, student assistance coordinator. We've got hundreds of kids. How is he or she ever going to possibly be able to do universal screening?
Yeah. So we, point to the time it takes first, that this is something that is not super time intensive, and there are resources in place, right? If they need to have a per diem on hand to cover regular responsibilities while the screenings are being done. We have heard from some school districts that they're having a hard time figuring out the staffing and would like to be able to hire a school adjustment counselor or someone with more substance use disorder expertise or somebody with lived experience. That's a little trickier. We'd love to, over time, make sure that we haven't stepped away, right? Now that implementation is happening and the bill is passed, we're still there advocating for resources. And if, we're able to identify a clear ask coming out of a lot of the districts around making sure that there is a certain level of expertise in some of the districts, that we're able to support that. That's sort of a longer term strategy. But the schools are also able to really make this as flexible as they need to. So the screenings don't have to be done during 1 week. In Massachusetts, the average amount of time it takes to do one grade level is a week if the school nurse is just doing all of the screenings all week long. So if we're doing 2 grade levels, about 2 weeks. There are some districts that do it that way all at once. There are also a lot of school districts that are breaking it up. That's a lot of larger districts. So instead of saying, we're going to have you dedicate all of your time to this until every student is done, they can do it over the course of the year. So, you might have this piece of the alphabet go in the month of September and just move through that way to break it up a little bit. So again, finding the right balance to implement in each district has been something that's been really important, both in the pilot phase and in full implementation. I'll go back here.
I was just going to ask, what role, if any, did the QHC school-based health centers play in supporting districts who maybe didn't have sufficient staffing or funding?
So the school-based health centers were actually doing ESPER before any of our in-school nurses were, at least in a formal way. They had received some grant funding to study implementation in that setting. So for the districts where there are school-based health centers, they were able to really support the inclusion of the rest of the school health team. And some of those districts have actually relied on the school-based health center to do a lot of the screening and referral if needed for assessment. Unfortunately, we have a small number of those school-based health centers and lots of districts, so we haven't been able to leverage that resource across the state. But for the districts that do have it, it's been enormously beneficial. So.
Yeah, what's the situation with private parochial schools?
So they are not required to implement ESPER. The charter schools are, but the private and parochial schools cannot be obligated through our Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed to utilize ESPER, though we have found that A lot of the private schools in Massachusetts, when there is something obligated through the public schools, they will often follow suit. And part of the reason for that is that they are required to send home a notice at the beginning of every school year, and this predates this mandate, that if there are health and wellness screenings that public schools do that they do not, they need to inform parents of that. So they might say, if you have a child entering the 10th grade, by law in Massachusetts, all 10th graders in public schools receive a scoliosis, BMI, and SBIRT screening. We do not conduct those screenings, or we only conduct one of those screenings, and please talk to your child's physician if you would like to ensure that they're getting that resource. Something to that effect. So because of that, a lot of the private schools and parochial schools do end up implementing similar wellness programs, and they're also able to take advantage of the training. Technical assistance CPH wants to make sure that where this is done, it's done well.
What about funding?
So that's a little trickier, right? So the training is essentially a free resource. So our Bureau of Substance Abuse Services in Massachusetts funds MassBIRT to do SBIRT trainings across the state for a variety of health and wellness professionals. So they can participate in those trainings. The resources for per diem are not going to be in place for the private schools. That's a little trickier.
New Jersey is on the verge of legalizing marijuana. Advocates are challenging the current bill that's on the table to make sure that it addresses harms done to communities of color in the past, but also prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Would you suggest as a strategy that advocates would link this legislation, because prevention is not defined, it hasn't been thoroughly worked out, and so and given the experience in Massachusetts, was it better as a standalone campaign, or given this thing, because the likely winner has said he's going to sign it, he's going to legalize marijuana, so
we had an interesting process in Massachusetts. I don't know how much anyone is like nerdily following along what's happening with marijuana legalization in other states. Just kidding. We had the opportunity to pass a bill last session in Massachusetts. Now, I was not thrilled about the idea of recreational marijuana being legalized in Massachusetts for a whole host of reasons. Primarily, it's going to make it a lot easier for young people to get their hands on marijuana, because even if it's still legal for them to possess it, you can't stop their 21-year-old older sibling from growing it at home in your bedroom, right? You can't legislate that people who have kids can't grow it, because we're essentially now saying we're going to treat this like alcohol. We're not preventing parents from homebrewing beer. So we're also not going to prevent parents from homegrown marijuana. There's a whole host of reasons that it makes it more readily available for adolescents. At the same time, we ended up legalizing it through a ballot measure that was written by and for the marijuana industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar burgeoning industry of essentially wealthy white men, right? So it wasn't written from a lens of health equity, racial justice, protecting youth, prevention. It had a very narrow focus, and it was making sure that an industry could get up and running very quickly in Massachusetts and start making money. So we had to then go back and pass legislation afterwards. We were successful in getting a provision in the implementation bill that passed recently that requires that some funding revenues go toward prevention, specifically for evidence-based and evidence-informed programs that address education, treatment, and prevention for adolescents. Unfortunately, the legislature declined to put any target funding in there, so we don't have percentages. So we're lumped in with public safety, with research, with funding for the Cannabis Control Commission. So it's all of these moving pieces. I mean, there's certainly public safety is going to need funding, right? Figuring out how to adjust to the new landscape, and making sure that there's adequate training in place. The Cannabis Control Commission needs funding for their staffing to make sure that they're able to monitor and legislate properly, but we really need to make sure that prevention is funded. So having it in there is a win. So I would certainly, to that end, say, to the extent that you can tie prevention to legalization, that's important. It feels a little bit like a speeding train that can't be stopped right now. So I think that it's worthwhile to fight against it, but having the fallback of ensuring that we are making a significant investment in prevention, because we know this is going to increase use, is worthwhile.
Did you track which legislators both promoted legalized marijuana and Esper?
Yeah.
I mean, were they the same people?
I
mean, because I would do that here in New Jersey, because this is a big issue for me. I think the optics of legalizing marijuana, kids are going to come in and go, yeah, well, you know.
Well, I mean, we have the data, right?
You know, I can do this in 2 more years, or.
And we have the data to show, right, that as medical marijuana is legalized and as recreational marijuana is legalized, right, the risk perception among youth drops and the use goes up. Correct. Really interesting to show that. So, and that's something that we did talk about a lot with legislators. So we did sort of make that case as they were figuring out implementation bills that, you know, this is happening now. It's a foregone conclusion. We have passed the ballot initiative. Recreational marijuana is coming next summer. So we need to make sure that now we're making this investment in prevention. For the most part, the legislators, off the top of my head, who supported legalization were not legislators who were extremely vocal, at least, about their support of Esper.
But how did they vote? That's what I want to know. Because even if they're not talking about it, just the fact that they're voting yes is to me, it's critical.
So we tend to have a lot of up or down votes in Massachusetts. We have a very small Republican minority in the House and the Senate, and the votes on almost everything have to be down entirely along party line, and the entire majority votes for the speaker. We had bipartisan support for Esper, the provision when there were amendments in the House and the Senate, and I don't think we had any no votes among Democrats, and we had several Republicans join the Democrats in voting yes for the Esper provisions.
Well, great. I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, 2-part. You mentioned the assessment for reform. I'd like to hear your personal assessment to success, getting past some barriers. First part. Second part, when you did receive the funding, what was your major focus in actually applying that funding to yield results?
So, first, the marijuana reform, or the?
No, you just mentioned that there was an uphill battle as far as reform is concerned. I want to hear your personal assessment on what would create success if you get past some barriers or some obstacles. What would open up that portal?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in terms of reforming the way that we're delivering prevention in schools through the Esper, and, you know, time is actually the first resource that I would love more of. I think one of the things that is really difficult about prevention work is that it's not sexy, right? We were talking a little bit about this earlier. It's really hard to show in an immediate way where you can do a lot of other sort of treatment focused things, an immediate result. Because we can't look at a kid again and say like, well, you were gonna start using marijuana, but because you had Espert in your school, you didn't. We just can't do that because none of us have a crystal ball. Wouldn't that make life easy? So it would be really nice to be able to speed up time and look into the future and be able to say, here are some of the outcomes that we've seen long term from this. But short of that, I think, you know, as long as we can maintain consistent funding, this is going to be something that is really helpful for our schools. The schools have this, the response has been overwhelming. They're excited to have an actual tool that has some evidence behind it that they can use. Would love to see some tight coordination within some of the districts around how this is timed, which can be tough. But you know, almost every school district now has speakers come in to speak, right, about substance use, about the experience that they've had personally in their lives. And I am able to remember sitting in the auditorium and listening to speakers and watching some of the kids who I knew were already using substances, and you know, they're sitting back laughing, rolling their eyes, and maybe it was just going on their back. But I, at that point, I had parents who were very involved in all the protective factors in the world, and I am like, well, success story of like, oh, those protective things worked for me. But I still felt impacted by it. This is terrifying. Like, your story is definitely scaring the crap out of me. And so maybe it rolled off the backs of those kids who were rolling their eyes, but maybe they were also checking out for their friends because of the social pressure as a teen, right? So it would be really nice to see some targeting of having those recovery speakers and presentations and performances that we have in the schools tied to Espert, so that you might be priming that pump in a way that's more public, right? And so you're planting those seeds, maybe opening up an interest in talking in that student's head, and then giving them an opportunity in private, away from their peers, to have a conversation about their substance use.
Cool. Thank you. Now what I'd like to do now is, this is great, and yay for Mass